What actually happened in a medieval battle? Not the choreographed movie set with soaring strings and heroes trading elegant blows, but the mud-slicked, bone-rattling mess that real people had to stumble through. If you've ever wondered what it felt like from inside the line, this is where the romance gets peeled away. First truth. If you were a regular foot soldier, you probably never even heard the order to attack. Signals were horns, drums, flags great in theory, useless once the shouting started. The hornman? He wasn't shoulder to shoulder with you. He stood well behind the crush where he could, survive. Smartest job on the field right after king who doesn't personally close with the enemy. The first seconds weren't glorious. They were clumsy. Lines didn't surge like a single wall of iron. They lurched. Men tripped over ruts and roots and each other. Battlefields weren't groomed plazas. They were fields with holes, stones, and hidden snags that waited to send you face first into the earth. Nothing punctures the myth of the fearless warrior like whacking your shin on a buried stump and yelling something your mother wouldn't be proud of. That charge? It was more of a shuffle. Your knees were jelly from standing in formation for ages. Your shoulders were tight from the weight of a shield you'd been gripping too hard. And every step threatened to slide out from under you. To your left and right, the line breathed and twitched like a single animal that wasn't sure whether to flee or pounce. The smell hit next. Sweat, damp wool, old leather, and whatever your neighbor had for breakfast. Medieval breath mints didn't exist, which might explain why shouting felt like the only way to get air that didn't taste like garlic and fear. Everybody screamed. Nobody could say what they screamed. It wasn't language so much as noise sound used as armor, a way to push the panic down and make your body do what your mind didn't want to. If you could translate it, a lot of those battle cries would come out as, "I really don't want to be here," in 50 regional accents. Your whole world narrowed to the few feet in front of you, and then impact. The first hit didn't look like cinema. No perfect parry, just a jolt that ran up your bones when shield met shield or shoulder met breastplate. Your ears rang, but you couldn't tell whether it was from the blow or from the man beside you head-butting someone through a visor. The soundscape wasn't epic music. It was metal on wood, wood on bone, boots in mud, air knocked out of lungs. Your forearm buzzed with that sick, numb ache from blocking a strike a little too late. Your plan, if you had one, shrunk to a single objective. Stay on your feet. On the ground, you were furniture. And furniture got trampled. Within a minute, the soil underfoot turned slick with what nobody wanted to look down at. Your gambeson, the padded jacket under armor, did its job, which was to soak sweat and keep your skin from being sanded off by steel. It also worked like a personal sauna. The sun didn't need to be ruthless. The helmet did that for it. A helmet could save your life and still make you feel like your brain was cooking. Vision narrowed to a thin slot. You could see just enough to be afraid of what you couldn't see. This was not a dance of steel. It was a shove match with sharp edges. The crush made proper technique a luxury. You didn't have room for sweeping cuts. You had a few inches. So you jabbed. You stabbed. You poked like you were trying to reach the last pickle at the bottom of a jar, except the jar was moving and also trying to take your head off. 5-on-1 wasn't dishonorable. It was common sense. The code most men followed wasn't chivalry. It was, "I would like to go home." When somebody did go down, the fight bent around them like a whirlpool. That's when the really ugly physics took over. Downward blows aimed at the crown of the head, the back of the neck, or wherever a gap presented itself were frighteningly effective. The man under the pile was a target and an obstacle, and neither of those positions ended well. It's not pretty, but a kick to a hand trying to rise, a stamp on a knee, a thrust at an armpit revealed by a slip. These were the things that actually finished fights. On a congested field, mercy lived somewhere far away. The sword on your hip looked heroic, but the heavy metal ball on a stick, the mace, suddenly made more sense. Where a blade skittered off plate or chewed into mail without stopping what was underneath, a mace dented, crushed, and broke. If a sword was a scalpel, a mace was a sledgehammer, and in a crowd, you didn't finesse with a scalpel. Even swords, when used by people who wanted results in tight quarters, got flipped into what fight books later called half-swording. You grabbed your blade with the offhand and drove the point like a short spear, or you reversed and slammed the pommel, the heavy knob on the hilt, into faces and joints. There's a grim honesty in the nickname that stuck. The murder stroke. It says the quiet part out loud. Armor helped sometimes in ways that felt like a cruel joke. Mail caught edges but could drive links into flesh beneath. Plate turned a cut into a concussive thud that rattled bones. Save your life? Absolutely. Translate a fatal gash into a broken clavicle and a fight-ending shock? Often. But armor didn't make you invincible. It made you slower, hotter, and very aware of every gap where air could get in and weapons could follow. Heat built fast. Inside a closed helm, your breath bounced back warm and wet. After a short burst of exertion, the world tunneled. You told yourself you were fine while your body decided otherwise, tingling fingers, wobbling knees, that iron taste at the back of the tongue. Even men who never took a blade sometimes collapsed, cooked by their own gear and the crush of bodies. And if you slipped, and everyone slipped, you had the span of a couple of heartbeats to get upright before boots made decisions for you. Lots of soldiers didn't die in a blaze of glory. They suffocated face down in muck inches deep. Orientation evaporated. Turn to meet a threat on the left, and the right opened. Track the man in front of you, and the one behind you made his move. Colours and badges meant to tell friend from foe smeared with grime. You didn't so much choose targets as you reacted to motion. Your brain, which had big plans an hour ago, ceded control to whatever instincts you'd drilled on a practice field. The rest was noise, and the noise kept coming. The line surged. You staggered with it. A gap opened. You lurched into it without thinking, because hesitation was how the next blow found home. Your shield edge cracked. You adjusted. Your weapon stuck in wood or leather or something you didn't want to name. You yanked once, twice too long, and in that stretched-out second, you became a silhouette someone else swung at. There was nothing cinematic about any of it, just a grinding contest of balance, breath, and blunt force. If you're picturing orderly duels breaking out all across the field, erase that. The scrum didn't allow it. By the time you were 2 minutes in, your idea of battle had shrunk to survival math. Keep feet under hips, keep something between you and sharp things, keep breathing. Look for elbows and wrists joints that fail. Listen for the hollow sound of a blow landing on wood that's an opening. Feel the line behind you if it thins, step back, or you'll be wrapped. Think small, act fast, and don't fixate. Fixation got you blindsided. Through the visor slit you caught a pair of eyes wide, wild, human, and for a heartbeat you both looked like boys shoved into the deep end. Whoever told you this was glorious hadn't been here. Then the crowd pushed again, and the moment vanished under another shove, another clang, another grunt that felt like it came from someone else's chest. And this choking, shoving, sweltering mess was only the opening act. If you made it past the first crush with your weapon still in your hands and your knees still locked, the battlefield had more to throw at you. Tools built to smash what armor could save. Shafts meant to reach you before you could swing. Blades that bent or snapped at exactly the wrong moment. And 1,000 cheap, improvised ways to turn a farm into a war. But first you had to keep your feet, keep your breath, and keep your fear from making the decisions for you. Because out here, nobody played a solo. Out here, the whole orchestra was trying to break its instruments. If you held onto your footing and your nerve through the opening crush, the next lesson came fast. The battlefield was a toolbox, and most of the tools weren't elegant. They were built to break, pry, poke, and crush whatever kept you from reaching the fragile parts of another human being. Forget the museum shine, most war gear in the line looked like it had been hammered together yesterday by someone with a deadline and a hangover. Take the axe. No fantasy filigree, just a wedge of iron with a hungry edge. If you could swing a log splitter, you could swing this. You didn't need perfect form, you needed a target and momentum. Shields hated axes. So did forearms behind shields. The ugly truth was that an axe didn't have to cut all the way through to do damage, just bite, twist, and wrench joints until something gave. But axes carried a curse. They loved to stick. In planks, in leather, in links of mail, in ribs. That satisfied thud, that brutal bite the moment your weapon sunk past the edge, felt great until you had to rip it free while bodies slammed you on all sides. You got 2 hard yanks, maybe 3. Any longer, and your axe became an anchor with your name on it. Then there were spears, the most honest weapon on the field. A straight line with a point. Cheap to make, simple to teach, terrifying in numbers. A hedge of spearheads kept horsemen cautious and swordmen unhappy. 6 to 8 feet of reach let you hurt someone who couldn't yet touch you. In formation, spears turned nervous farmers into a wall. Out of formation, they became liabilities that snagged on friends and found thighs you didn't mean to stab. Your sightline narrowed, your hands shook, and that neat thrust you drilled 100 times at practice slid off a shoulder or buried itself in a shield rim and stuck there like a nail in old wood. Worse, in the crush, your buddy's spear rear end jabbed the back of your knee. You cursed him, he cursed you, and the enemy thanked you both. Maces solved a problem swords couldn't. Plate armor. You didn't slice iron, you moved it. The head of a mace flanged, spiked, or smooth was a portable physics lesson. The goal wasn't to draw blood. It was to turn the inside of a man into soup while his outside stayed mostly intact. Even mail, the knitted fabric of rings that shrugged off shallow cuts, had nothing kind to say about maces. A good hit caved in the padding under it and left bones looking like cracked pottery. That's the nasty compromise of protective gear. It saves your life by translating lethal cuts into survivable, sometimes not blunt trauma. From the inside of a helmet, both feel like an earthquake, and both make you rethink your career choices. Swords got the songs, but on most fields they were the minority report. Steel good enough for a reliable sword was expensive, and so was the craft to shape it. A well-made blade made you feel like a hero, until it bent after a bad parry or snapped when you tried to wrench it sideways in a shield rim. A broken sword turned into a dagger with a handle. Plenty of men fought on with those jagged stubs because fights didn't pause for repairs. The clever ones adapted. They slid a hand up the flat of the blade for half-swording, jabbing the point into gaps, armpits, groins, visors. Or they gripped high on the blade and used the pommel as a hammer, slamming that dense metal knob into brows, knuckles, and jaw hinges. It wasn't pretty, but pretty didn't make it home. And the farm came to war. Flails, originally for beating grain, became nightmare tools when the spiked head arced over a shield's top and crashed into someone who thought they were safe. Billhooks and glaives, hedge trimmers with ambitions sheared at legs and snagged reins. Pitchforks made improvisational pikes. Shovels, when sharpened, did surgical, hateful work. You laughed at them until you saw what a sharp spade could do to a knee. Plenty of line troops pressed farmers, townsmen, anyone trying to bring coin home showed up with whatever they could afford or steal. The miracle wasn't perfection, it was numbers. Craft quality varied like the weather. Nobles sported well-tempered blades and hand-fitted mail. The rank and file got whatever the quartermaster scrounged. Loose heads, splintered halves, cheap iron that held an edge like cheese, these were common. You knew a weapon was good when it didn't surprise you. Meanwhile, shields unloved in the tales did as much killing as saving when their bosses, those metal center plates, punched noses flat, and their rims chopped fingers grasping at edges. A cracked shield didn't retire. It got flipped, pressed, jammed, used as a door to wedge someone off balance. Everything became a lever if you were desperate enough. Armor, for all its miracles, came with warnings printed in sweat. Mail drank weight when wet. Plate made you a bell hits, rang your skull like a clapper. Every joint was a question mark. Armpits, elbows, backs of knees. The crease where the gorget met the breast. Those were directions for anyone who could read the map. The smartest fighters didn't swing harder. They swung shorter and aimed for the punctuation. A quick jab into the gap under an arm could end a story faster than any heroic overhead chop. The wounds that followed didn't read like the movies either. Cuts weren't clean lines. They were ragged pages. Axes left a page torn halfway out. Maces wrote invisible paragraphs, internal bleeding. Ribs like a broken fence. Organs bruised to silence. Mail embedded itself in skin when a blow smashed it down, turning every ring into a tiny coin pressed into flesh. Split shields threw splinters like darts that found cheeks and eyes. Teeth flew when helmets took a glancing smash. You didn't always notice the worst damage when it happened. Adrenaline is a liar with a friendly voice. Blood loss took charge fast. 2 pints gone, and your world narrowed. You thought you were still in the fight because your arms were moving, then your knees gave way like rotten stools. Plenty of men sat down without meaning to, convinced the ground had jumped up at them. Others carried on with gashes they'd have fainted from in a quiet room. Pain had categories out here. Ignore harder, and you're done. A belt wrapped tight above a wound might buy you minutes. Heat from a blade might cauterize. More often, the only medicine at hand was luck. Then the mind began to slip. Direction evaporated. The banner you swore to follow drifted behind a hill of bodies. Colors smeared into the same brown. You learned to recognize friend from foe by rhythm, more than symbols, how someone stepped, how their shield rose, the shape of their helmet brim. And still, men struck friends. You don't mean to, but your brain scans for motion and your body answers. That's how accidental kills happen. A flinch, a twitch, a swing at the wrong shadow. Later, you replay it and tell yourself a different version. In the moment, you move or you die. Breathing turned into a project. Inside a closed helm, each inhale brought your own heat back to you. The padding at your cheeks held sweat like a sponge. You swallowed metal-tasting spit, blinked stinging salt from your eyes, and told your hands not to cramp. Cramp anyway, they said. You shook them out between exchanges like a scribe trying to wake up numb fingers, then gripped the haft again and prayed your grip would hold for one more shove. Every sense lied a little. Sound blurred into a constant iron rain. Sight tunneled until you reacted to shapes, not faces. Touch lagged by the time the pain of a hit arrived. The next movement was already required. Smell stopped being a sense and became the air, sweat, leather, damp earth, hot iron, the sharp iron, coin scent that meant blood. You didn't register disgust. You registered information. Slippery ground here, soft step there. Someone fell, pressure changed, move. And amid this, choices simplified. You didn't run clever tactics in your head. You stacked tiny decisions. Step, shove, strike, guard, breathe. Scan left shoulder height. Incoming, raise edge, catch, counter low, don't chase, reset. The men who lived weren't always the strongest. They were the ones who made 100 of those small choices correctly enough in a row. That, and fortune, and the simple fact of where they happened to be standing when other men slipped. If all of this sounds more like a dangerous crowd disaster than a gallery of duels, that's because it was. The longer you stayed upright, the more the weapons around you began to fail. Spear shafts cracked, axe edges dulled and bounced, sword tangs, those hidden cores inside grips, loosened, shields shattered into bite-sized boards that still, somehow, blocked the next jab. And when your main tool died, you reached for the nearest orphaned one on the ground. No loyalty, no sentiment. You grabbed what worked. Because while stories loved the clean arc of a hero and his blade, the field loved something else. Effectiveness. The tool in your hands didn't matter as much as the next breath in your lungs and the next inch of ground under your boots. And the longer the pushing and breaking went on, the more minds started asking a very practical question, one that decided more outcomes than any banner ever did. Is this the moment to stand, or the moment to run? If you managed to keep your weapon in hand and your body upright long enough, the real test of a medieval battle wasn't your sword arm, it was your will. Because once the chaos stretched past a few minutes, the field became less about skill and more about endurance, confusion, and luck. The truth? Most men never fought to the bitter end. They fought until their nerves snapped. And when it did, the battlefield changed in an instant. The human brain wasn't designed to process that much noise, heat, and fear all at once. After the first crush, most soldiers slipped into what modern psychologists call tunnel vision. Shapes, not people. Movements, not motives. A swing from the left? Block. A blur at your right knee? Kick. You didn't think. You reacted. Later, survivors often swore they remembered nothing. They fought in a trance, like puppets pulled by instinct. The conscious mind tapped out, leaving only survival routines. You weren't a knight or a peasant anymore. You were just an animal in a stampede, lashing out at whatever brushed too close. Orientation dissolved. Which way was forward? Which way was home? In training, you drilled to follow banners, horns, the steady voice of a commander. In battle, banners fell, horns drowned in the roar, and commanders were just as lost in the crush as you. Accounts suggest that after 10 minutes of combat, more than half of medieval fighters couldn't point to where their own camp was. Men turned in circles, stumbled into allies, and lashed out before realizing too late that they'd cut down their own side. Chroniclers note that at Towton in 1461, a battle so bloody it froze, rivers with corpses. Some estimates suggest 1 in 10 dead fell to friendly blows. In the press, the difference between enemy and ally was mud deep and heartbeat short. Blood made liars out of everyone. Splashes painted you from head to toe. Whose blood? No time to check. Plenty of men died only after realizing the sticky warmth soaking their tunic was their own lifeblood. Others stumbled away, drenched in gore, untouched beneath it. The surreal sight of comrades painted red but unhurt rattled men already fighting for clarity. When your hand came away wet, you couldn't know if you had seconds or hours left. And fear made every drop feel like the end. Weapons broke, bent, or slipped from sweaty fingers. In that moment, desperation taught creativity. A fallen spear became a stabbing stake. A broken sword turned into a dagger. A rock, a plank, even the edge of a dented helm could serve. Men clubbed with whatever they could grasp. There are accounts of fighters using skulls from fallen enemies as makeshift bludgeons. Horrific, yes, but on a battlefield, survival trumped dignity. Then there was the running. Battles didn't usually end with one side nobly slaughtered to the last. They ended when enough men decided, almost at once, "I'm done." It was contagious. One man dropped his weapon and bolted. 2 more followed. 10 saw them, panicked and joined. Panic was the real general on most medieval fields. The largest, fiercest armies sometimes shattered not from casualties but from fear blooming like wildfire. Once a retreat began, it fed itself. If the man next to you ran, you had seconds to decide. Hold and maybe die, or run and maybe live. Survival instinct made the choice for most. And here's the part movies skip: running wasn't safe. Turning your back in armor was like announcing, "Free target." Cavalry loved to chase, and so did rival infantry who suddenly felt bold. Exhaustion added its own cruelty. In heavy mail or plate, a sprint lasted maybe 100 yards before lungs and legs gave out. Then you were caught, too winded to lift your arms. More than one knight fell not to a heroic duel, but to tripping on roots while fleeing and being swarmed like prey. Others played dead. Dropped flat, went limp, prayed the boots stepping over them belonged to men too busy to double-check. It worked sometimes, but risked a final kick or spear thrust, just in case. Still, for many, feigning death beat dying for real. One French soldier's chronicle describes crawling inside the carcass of a horse to hide until dark. He lived to tell it, though probably not with much appetite afterward. Even victory looked nothing like the stories. If you were still standing when the dust thinned and the shouting ebbed, congratulations, you'd won. But nobody cheered. Nobody waved flags. Most survivors sank to the ground where they stood, too drained to speak. Triumph was measured in breaths still being drawn, limbs still attached. The unglamorous checklist of survival read: heads on, arms move, legs carry weight, friends nearby, not dead. That was it. That was victory. After battle, the field turned into a grisly marketplace. Dead men didn't keep their armor. Survivors stripped it for anything usable: breastplates, gauntlets, even boots if they were better than your own. Nothing went to waste. A good sword from a corpse might mean living through the next clash. That kind of recycling wasn't dishonor, it was necessity. The living picked the dead clean, and the carrion birds followed after. Then came the ale. Chroniclers describe armies drinking for days after major battles, not in celebration but in escape. The sights, the sounds, the nightmares needed drowning. Ale was the closest thing to medicine for minds scarred by horror. Men drank until memories blurred, until screams became muffled by haze, until their hands stopped shaking. But the real aftermath? That followed them home. Nights where sleep shattered at phantom blows. Limbs aching from bruises they hadn't noticed in the fight. Sudden shouts at shadows in doorways. Wives and children puzzled or frightened by fathers who flinched at slammed doors or punched the air in their sleep. Medieval records rarely mention trauma in words we'd use today, but it was there. It lived in haunted eyes and sudden silences. And beyond the survivors' hearts, the battlefield itself kept memory. Mud closed over broken helmets and bent spearheads. For centuries, farmers ploughing the land would unearth jagged fragments, reminders that beneath their furrows lay layers of war. No battlefield was ever truly cleared. It simply sank into the soil, waiting to remind anyone who dug too deep what men had done there. The breaking point wasn't just the moment soldiers fled. It was the point where battles stripped away illusion, where glory rotted into fear, exhaustion, and the grim reality that winning meant you hadn't died yet. And if you thought surviving the clash was the hardest part, you hadn't yet faced what came next. The wounds that lingered, the infections that spread, and the crude medicine that killed as often as it healed. Because the fight didn't end when swords went silent, it carried on, in ways just as cruel, long after the field emptied. Surviving the clash was only half the story. If the field didn't kill you, the wounds it left behind often tried their best to finish the job. Forget Hollywood images of warriors striding off with a bandaged arm and a smirk. Most medieval injuries were neither simple nor survivable. They lingered, festered, and haunted. And the battlefield, more than anything, was a factory for wounds that no clean sword cut could ever neatly explain away. Armor gave a sense of safety, but it lied. Chainmail could stop a slash once or twice, but an axe or mace turned those links into tiny knives pressed deep into the skin. Plate deflected a cut, but the force translated into broken bones beneath. A man could walk away from a blow with skin intact but ribs shattered inward like pottery. For surgeons, monks with knives, mostly that was a nightmare. You couldn't stitch what you couldn't see. So men died of bleeding lungs, ruptured livers, or brains that swelled unseen until they shut down. The cutting weapons weren't kinder. A sword slice rarely came clean. Iron tore and mangled, leaving flaps of flesh that resisted stitching. A shoulder strike could take the whole arm with it. Fingers and hands, those fragile edges always poking from gauntlets, were lost in swipes nobody remembered making. Chroniclers talk about maimed survivors, men who returned with one hand missing or faces half gone. The battlefield didn't just take lives, it took livelihoods. A farmer missing his strong arm might as well have been buried alongside his sword. Blood loss was merciless. A body holds about 10 pints. Lose 2 quickly, and you faint. Lose 3, and you're halfway to gone. Soldiers collapsed within minutes of major wounds, often before they realized they'd been struck. Adrenaline lied, kept them moving until their vision blurred and their knees folded. One chronicler wrote of knights fighting on with faces pale as wax before slumping silently in the mud. Nobody noticed at first they looked alive until they weren't. Blunt injuries were worse than cuts. A mace to the chest might not draw a drop of blood, but it turned ribs into splinters that stabbed the lungs. A blow to the head through a helmet scrambled the brain. Men staggered away thinking they were fine, only to collapse hours later, victims of swelling and unseen bleeding. Medieval physicians had no words like concussion or hemorrhage. They only had the awful observation: he was well, and then he was not. The small wounds carried their own curses. Splinters from shields embedded in eyes. Teeth knocked out by shield bosses. Gashes that looked minor at first swelled red and hot days later, reeking with infection. In an age without antibiotics, the smallest cut could end a life. Monastery records note that for every soldier who died in battle, 3 more often died afterward from infections. The battlefield's real killer wasn't steel, it was bacteria no one yet understood. Treatment was crude, often desperate. The best you could hope for was a belt tied tight above the wound to slow bleeding, or a dagger heated in fire and pressed to cauterize a gash. It worked sometimes. Other times it cooked the flesh into rot. Surgical tools weren't sterilized. A knife wiped on a rag might go from one patient to the next. Success rates for battlefield surgery? Roughly 30%. The most common procedure was amputation. Not because it was always needed, but because it was quick. Cut off the limb, pray the bleeding stopped, and move on. Few lived long enough to curse the choice. Field hospitals, when they existed, weren't the neat rows of cots we imagine. They were tents with straw floors, buzzing flies, and men laid shoulder to shoulder moaning. Doctors, often clerics, moved with grim efficiency. Pain relief was ale, opium if you were lucky, or a wooden stick between your teeth. Infection turned wounds black. Amputees screamed as saws bit through bone. The smell of blood and burned flesh mixed with incense in a grotesque parody of a church service. One chronicler compared the sound inside a field tent to a choir of the damned, and yet some lived. Against all odds, scarred men limped home. But the cost was high. Trauma didn't have a name then, but it had faces. Men who flinched at every loud noise, who woke screaming from dreams of the press of bodies and the crush of shields. Husbands who returned silent, eyes hollow, unable to describe what they'd seen. The medieval world had little sympathy for invisible wounds. You were expected to pray, confess, and carry on. Many drank instead. Others wandered as mercenaries, unable to farm or settle. The war lived on in them, long after the banners came down. And for those who didn't make it, the battlefield itself became their coffin. Most bodies were buried in mass pits, stripped of gear first. No funeral rites, no names marked. Just trenches of the fallen, filled quick to ward off plague. Archaeologists today still uncover these graves. Jumbles of bones, many with skulls cleaved, ribs shattered, limbs missing. They tell the story better than any chronicler, the story of what weapons did to flesh, and of how many never left the mud they fell in. What movies call a wound of honor was, in reality, the beginning of a slow death. And what movies call survival was often the start of a lifetime scarred in body and mind. But wounds weren't the only danger after battle. Hunger, thirst, and disease stalked armies even more relentlessly than swords. And for every soldier terrified of an enemy's blade, there was equal dread of what awaited in camp. Spoiled food, foul water, and sickness that could wipe out more men than the day's fighting ever did. If the clash itself didn't break you, the days and weeks around it could. A medieval battle wasn't just the thunder of steel, it was the endless grind of marching, starving, waiting, and getting sick in ways that felt as brutal as any wound. Soldiers feared the enemy, but they feared their own camp almost as much. Because once the swords went quiet, hunger and disease started their own campaign. Armies didn't travel light. Thousands of men on the move meant thousands of mouths to feed, horses to water, fires to keep burning. Supply trains struggled to keep up. Grain spoiled, barrels leaked, herds thinned. Rations shrank fast. A soldier might begin a march with bread, salted pork, and a jug of ale. A week later, he was gnawing on mouldy crusts or whatever roots and scraps he could find along the road. Archaeological digs around medieval encampments have turned up animal bones hacked in desperation, some so small they came from dogs or rats. Hunger didn't care about pride. Water was worse. Streams near camps quickly turned foul, polluted by waste, blood, and the runoff from latrines dug too close. Thirst forced men to drink anyway. Dysentery followed. One English chronicler described it bluntly. The ground was painted red and brown, not with blood, but with the flux of the bowels. Dysentery could rip through an army faster than arrows, dropping men in their tracks, too weak to march, too fevered to fight. At Agincourt, sickness killed more Englishmen than French swords ever did. The march itself was a gauntlet. Armour weighed heavy, boots rubbed raw, shoulders ached under packs and weapons. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud that sucked men down to their ankles. Feet blistered, split, and bled. Soldiers tied rags, straw, or even moss around them for relief. Infection often followed. Trench foot wasn't named yet, but it existed. Blackened toes, foul smells. Men hobbling before the battle even began. Sometimes the worst enemy was simply the road, and then came the weather. Heat roasted men inside armour, leaving them fainting from dehydration. Cold stiffened fingers until weapons slipped uselessly from hands. At Crécy, men collapsed from exhaustion before the fighting even started, drained by the long slog to the field. At winter campaigns, frostbite gnawed ears and noses, turning flesh black and brittle. Snow-soaked gambesons that froze stiff overnight. Few soldiers feared wounds as much as they feared sleeping wet and waking stiff, already half dead before the sun rose. Disease had other names too: typhus, smallpox, plague. Soldiers slept side by side, breathed the same foul air, shared blankets and bowls. One coughing comrade could doom hundreds. Camps became incubators. At times, commanders never saw battle because sickness emptied ranks before they marched. In the 14th century, some campaigns ended without a fight at all. Armies melted under invisible enemies. The Black Death made sure every soldier knew that an unseen foe could kill quicker than any knight's blade. Camp life carried its own cruelties. Discipline was harsh. Men caught stealing from rations could lose fingers. Deserters might be hanged before their friends as a warning. Floggings drew blood in front of the entire company. Armies weren't brotherhoods of equals, they were tinderboxes of fear, boredom, and punishment. And yet camaraderie grew in the cracks. Fires shared. Songs mumbled through cracked lips, jokes about foul-smelling stew. Gallows humour became a shield as much as steel. Soldiers learned to laugh at misery, because if they didn't, they'd break. Religion gave another layer. Priests marched with armies, reminding men that death was close, and confession was wise. Before battles, masses were held, relics displayed, banners kissed. It gave soldiers courage, or at least something to cling to. Many believed a holy relic might turn a blade, or that a saint's blessing could guide their hand. Faith and fear twined together, making men believe God watched their every swing. But if God was with them, why did so many die in the mud? That question lingered silently in many hearts. And when armies weren't fighting, they were looting. Villages unlucky enough to lie on a march route became supply depots. Soldiers seized bread, ale, livestock. Homes burned, women fled, and fields trampled under boots. For peasants, the passing of an army friend or foe was often worse than battle itself. Chroniclers admit it. More civilians died from armies foraging than from armies fighting. The line between soldier and bandit blurred quickly when hunger gnawed. For every knight polishing his code of honor, a dozen starving foot soldiers raided a farm. That reality stripped away illusions. War wasn't clean. It was mud on your boots, sickness in your belly, and guilt in your soul after stealing from the same kind of people you once were. Many soldiers confessed later, hoping prayers could cleanse what survival had forced them to do. This was the other face of medieval warfare. Not the charge, not the clash, but the slow, grinding attrition of bodies worn thin before they even met the enemy. Hunger, thirst, disease, and exhaustion were generals in their own right, often deciding who won before swords ever crossed. And even for those who endured all this, another terror waited at the end of the march. Not the enemy across the field, but the cavalry poised to thunder down and scatter you like chaff. Because the battlefield wasn't just men pushing and shoving, it was also the sudden, terrifying arrival of horses and the armoured giants riding them. If infantry battles felt like violent rugby scrums with sharp edges, cavalry charges were avalanches with hooves. Nothing in a medieval soldier's life prepared him for the sound of armoured horses bearing down. Chroniclers describe it like thunder rolling closer and closer until the ground itself shook. Imagine standing in a swamp of mud, exhausted, with your legs wobbling, and then seeing a wall of steel and horseflesh charging straight at you. Men prayed, some froze, some bolted. Very few stood calm. The horses weren't just transport, they were weapons. A destrier, the heavy warhorse of knights, could weigh over 1,000 pounds. Add barding, horse armour, and a rider encased in plate, and you had a living battering ram. Lances levelled, hooves churning, riders shouting, the line hit with a force that could crack bone through armour. Men weren't just knocked down, they were flung aside like straw. Archaeological digs show skeletons with pelvises crushed, as if stomped by stone. That was cavalry. Physics made flesh. But horses weren't invincible. Spears and pikes turned the charge into a gamble. A well-timed hedge of spear points could send even the fiercest charge recoiling. Horses didn't want to impale themselves any more than men did, and when they balked, the knight's power vanished. Accounts describe lines holding steady and knights tumbling as mounts swerved or fell. A fallen knight was suddenly less of a legend and more of a target crawling in the mud. 5 peasants with daggers could do what one knight never feared in a duel: bring him down. Still, when charges worked, they shattered morale. Infantry saw comrades fly, shields splinter, formations collapse. Fear spread faster than wounds. And once panic set in, a rout followed. Cavalry thrived on chasing runners. Lances lowered, swords raised, maces hammering down. It was slaughter, not battle. Many medieval battles ended this way, not with neat duels, but with one side fleeing while cavalry hunted them like prey. After the chaos, silence fell like a curtain. No trumpets, no victory parades. Just groans, whimpers, and the occasional scream that rose and died again. Survivors slumped where they stood, too numb to cheer. Chroniclers often note the eerie quiet of a battlefield once the killing stopped, a silence heavy with things unsaid. Victory wasn't joy, it was relief. Relief at being alive, at breathing, at moving fingers and toes. The celebration was often a sip of water, a collapse into mud, a whispered prayer. Then came the grisly work, stripping the dead, collecting weapons, hauling wounded to makeshift tents. A field after battle was a marketplace of death. Soldiers scavenged boots, belts, swords, and helmets. Even enemies became suppliers. Nothing went to waste, not when tomorrow's fight might depend on what you pulled from a corpse today. The noblest knights, if captured alive, might be ransomed for gold. Ordinary men, left to rot or shoveled into pits, nameless forever. And for the wounded who limped away, their battle wasn't over. A gash that didn't kill you in minutes could kill you in days with fever. Infection, called the rot, swelled wounds until skin split and blackened. Surgeons sawed off limbs in bloody tents where survival odds were as cruel as a coin toss. No one called it post-traumatic stress, but men carried nightmares home. They flinched at clattering pots, woke swinging at shadows, stared into firelight, remembering eyes that stared back at them through visor slits. Trauma didn't need a name to exist. Yet despite it all, armies kept marching. Peasant boys kept being levied. Knights kept polishing their codes of honor. Kings kept sending men to die for land or pride. Why? Because glory looked good in a song. Songs didn't smell of blood or record the sound of a man suffocating face down in mud. They sang of banners held high, not boots trampling the fallen. They left out the infection, the fear, the running. And so young men went, convinced by stories, only to learn that reality was sweat, screams, and silence. So what really happened in a medieval battle? Not the movie version, not the storybook duel. It was stumbling, suffocating chaos. It was men swinging wildly in mud and blood, praying to stand one more heartbeat. It was hunger, disease, terror, and chance deciding fates more often than skill. Glory was rare. Survival was the real prize. And if you lived long enough to see the field empty, to wipe blood yours or someone else's from your face, you learned the harshest truth of all. Medieval victory wasn't about banners or songs. It was simply this: you weren't dead yet. That was enough. That was everything.